You stand at the altar, repeating sacred vows you don't understand. The ceremony ends not with a kiss, but with a wave of dread. Because the tradition awaiting you in the marital chamber isn't about love. It's a violent ritual of proof, witnessed by guests and enforced by family. Across history, the wedding night was often a sanctioned nightmare. We've whitewashed these practices into romantic customs, but the truth is far darker. Victorian historians hid the evidence, but the documents don't lie. Tonight, you will hear the screams they edited out of history. Forget every romantic notion you've ever held about the past. For the institution of marriage, the very bedrock of society for millennia, was built not on a foundation of love, but on the cold, hard currency of economics and power. A brutal transaction where women and children were the principal commodities traded between men to solidify alliances, settle debts, and amass wealth. This was the universal, bleak truth that stretched from the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the stone castles of medieval Europe, a system so deeply ingrained that it was codified into the very first laws of human civilization. The infamous Code of Hammurabi, etched in stone nearly 40 years ago, doesn't speak of companionship or affection. It meticulously outlines the financial terms of a woman's transfer, stating that if a man wishes to divorce a wife who has borne him children, he must return her dowry and give her usufruct of field, garden, and property, to raise their children, not out of compassion, but to protect his own assets and lineage. In ancient Rome, the formula, "Where you are, Gaius, I am Gaia," masked the legal reality of the conventio in manum, a ceremony where the bride was literally handed over from her father's legal power to her husband's, becoming his property in the same vein as a slave or a piece of land, her personal wealth and future earnings now entirely his. Medieval European marriage contracts read like livestock sales or corporate mergers, with clauses specifying the exact weight of the silver to be paid, the acres of land to be transferred, and the political loyalties that would shift upon the consummation of the union. The woman's consent was rarely, if ever, sought, and her feelings were considered not just irrelevant, but a positive hindrance to the serious business of dynasty building. A daughter was an asset to be managed, a vessel for producing legitimate heirs, and a conduit for property, with her body serving as the seal on a contract she had no part in negotiating. The concept of romantic love, if it entered the equation at all, was viewed as a frivolous, dangerous, and potentially disruptive force, something to be laughed at in the courtly tales or secretly pursued in extramarital affairs, but never to be confused with the solemn, economic reality of matrimony. This systemic erasure of female autonomy meant that a woman's entire worth was extrinsic, measured by the size of her dowry, the political connections of her family, and her proven fertility, reducing her humanity to a series of checkboxes on a legal document that would dictate the entirety of her existence from birth until death, a life sentence passed without a trial. If the marriage transaction itself was a cold, calculated affair, the failure to meet its exacting financial terms could, and frequently did, unleash a wave of horrific, sanctioned violence, transforming the domestic sphere into a torture chamber, where the bride herself was punished for the economic crimes of her family, a practice so widespread and brutal that it deserves its own chapter in the annals of human cruelty, the dowry of death. This was not a hidden, shameful secret, but a terrifyingly open practice, legally encoded and socially accepted, where a woman's value was so intrinsically tied to her material worth that her life became forfeit if that worth was deemed insufficient. In ancient Rome, the dowry, or dose, was not a gift but a crucial part of the financial stability of the groom's household. And if the wife's family failed to make scheduled payments, or the husband simply desired an upgrade, he could legally murder her with impunity by charging her with adultery or poisoning, a common and easily fabricated accusation that conveniently allowed him to keep the dowry already paid, while freeing him to seek a more lucrative match. This systemic violence escalated to grotesque levels in medieval and Renaissance Europe, particularly in elite circles, where the relentless pursuit of larger dowries led to countless brides being found dead under mysterious circumstances, falling down stairs, choking on food, or suffering sudden, inexplicable illnesses shortly after the wedding, clearing the way for the husband to marry again and acquire another infusion of cash and land. However, the most chilling and systematic expression of this horror emerged in India, with the phenomenon of dowry deaths, a practice with ancient roots that saw a terrifying resurgence in the modern era. If a bride's family could not provide the promised cash, cars, or appliances, she would be subjected to relentless psychological torture, physical abuse, and, in countless horrific cases, murdered by being doused in kerosene and set alight, with the crime passed off to authorities as a tragic kitchen accident. This wasn't a secret. It was a calculated risk, a known and accepted outcome of the marital transaction, where a man could literally burn his wife alive for a better stereo or a newer model of refrigerator, and the legal system, reflecting the deep-seated cultural view of women as property, would often look the other way, thereby perpetuating a cycle of abuse and murder that treated human life as a negotiable commodity in a failed business deal. The dowry, intended to provide for the woman, became instead the instrument of her destruction, the final, brutal price tag on a life deemed worthless without the correct monetary value attached, a perpetual economic threat that hung over every marriageable daughter and created a culture of fear where the wedding altar could indeed become a funeral pyre. The transactional nature of marriage reached its most intimate and violently invasive peak, not in the negotiation chambers or with the exchange of wealth, but in the dreaded privacy of the wedding night, which was in fact a very public spectacle of verification, a ritualized defloration and examination that determined a woman's ultimate worth and very right to life, based on the flawed and cruel biological myth of the intact hymen, a practice known across continents and centuries that saw brides subjected to the humiliation of the consummation check. This ceremony, far from a private moment, was a community affair in medieval Europe, particularly among the nobility, where the marriage was not considered binding until consummation was verified, leading to the ritual of the showings of the sheets. The following morning, the blood-stained nuptial bedsheet would be displayed to the wedding guests, family members, and even parish priests as irrefutable proof of the bride's virginity and the groom's potency, a public declaration that the contract had been sealed and the goods were, as promised, untainted. The consequences for a lack of blood were dire and immediate. The bride could be instantly repudiated, her dowry forfeited, and she would be returned to her family in utter disgrace, who often viewed her as a now worthless asset and would force her into a nunnery or a life of servitude. Or worse, she could be subjected to beatings or even murdered by her new husband for the perceived fraud and insult to his honor, her life value obliterated by the absence of a single drop of blood. This practice was not confined to Europe. Among some Bedouin tribes, the public display of the sheet was a central part of the wedding celebration, and in ancient China, the family of the bride would send a box containing the proof of her purity to the groom's family the morning after, a tradition that placed the entire family's honor on a physiological phenomenon that is, from a medical standpoint, an unreliable and often non-existent indicator of virginity, leading to countless tragedies based on a scientific falsehood. The psychological and physical trauma inflicted by this ritual is almost unimaginable. Young women, often barely adolescents, were forced to perform sexually under immense pressure and fear, with an audience literally waiting outside the door, and the act itself was frequently painful and violent, framed not as intimacy but as a necessary violation to claim property and prove a point, scarring them for life and reducing the most intimate human connection to a cold, clinical inspection. This systemic demand for proof created a vile underground economy of counterfeits, where brides terrified of failing would procure vials of animal blood or prick their fingers to stain the sheets, a desperate act of survival in a world that valued a membrane more than their humanity. A world where a woman's entire moral character, her family's honor, and her very survival hinged on a biological fallacy. The commodification of women reached its most grotesque and heartbreaking extreme, not with the exchange of mature adults, but in the widespread global practice of child marriage, a sanctioned system of pedophilia and reproductive abuse that shattered the bodies and minds of countless girls, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, who were traded like livestock by their families to secure political alliances, settle blood feuds, or simply offload an economic burden onto another household, long before their bodies had even begun to mature. This was not an anomaly, but a deeply embedded social norm across ancient civilizations. In Rome, the legal age of marriage for girls was 12, a threshold that granted them no protection, but merely marked them as legally eligible for transfer. While in medieval Europe, royalty and nobility routinely betrothed infants in cradle marriages, with figures like Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, being married at 12 and giving birth to the future King of England at the traumatizingly tender age of 13. A delivery that left her small body so broken and injured that she never conceived again, a fate shared by countless unknown girls who perished in childbirth, their pelvises crushed by babies they were too physically immature to carry. The physical consequences were a medical horror show. Child brides, once their bodies were forced into sexual activity and pregnancy, suffered devastating obstetric fistulae tears between the birth canal and bladder or rectum that left them permanently incontinent, ostracized, and rotting from their own waste, a condition that remains a scourge in regions where the practice persists today. Their babies, if they survived the traumatic birth at all, were often born with deformities or low birth weight, continuing a cycle of suffering and early death that was the direct result of imposing adult sexual demands on a child's developing frame. Beyond the physical torture was the profound psychological annihilation. These girls were ripped from their homes and any semblance of childhood, forced to serve as domestic and sexual servants to men decades their senior, their identities erased and replaced with the sole purpose of producing an heir, leading to lifetimes of severe trauma, depression, and a complete absence of personal agency, their spirits broken long before their bodies eventually gave out. This global tragedy, from the Devadesis dedicated to temples in India to the young girls given as peace offerings between warring tribes, was rationalized by twisted religious and cultural doctrines that claimed it protected girls or preserved their purity, while in reality, it was the most brutal expression of a system that viewed female children not as human beings, but as the most malleable and disposable form of currency, their youth not a thing to be protected, but a vacuum to be filled with the ambitions and perversions of the adults who owned them. Yet, not every marital tradition involved direct physical mutilation or murder. Some operated on a more insidious level of psychological terror and communal humiliation, practices that were so deeply normalized they were mistaken for merriment, revealing a culture that found entertainment in the degradation of couples and enforced conformity through ritualized public shaming, a subtler but equally cruel form of control that maintained the social order by making examples of those who dared to deviate from its strict norms. The most widespread of these was the charivari, also known as rough music or skimmington, a cacophonous, violent mockery practiced across medieval Europe, where a village would gather outside the newlywed's home to create an ear-splitting din with pots, pans, and horns, a performance that was anything but celebratory. It was a punitive ritual aimed at couples who violated community standards, such as a widow remarrying too quickly, a husband deemed henpecked, or a pair with a significant age difference. and this festive gathering could quickly escalate into beatings, the forcing of the humiliated couple to parade backwards on a donkey, or even the destruction of their property, all under the thin guise of tradition and good fun. Similarly, the concept of the shotgun wedding, often romanticized in modern folklore, had a brutally literal and dark origin. Originating in the American frontier, where a father would indeed use the threat of a loaded firearm to compel a reluctant suitor to marry his pregnant daughter, not to preserve her honor, but to ensure the family did not have to bear the economic burden of an illegitimate child, and to force the man who damaged his property into providing financial compensation through a lifetime of obligation, reducing marriage to a transaction made at gunpoint. Even the seemingly adventurous Norse tradition of bride kidnapping, often portrayed as a passionate elopement, was in reality a terrifying and violent act of abduction, where a woman was seized from her home by a suitor and his armed companions, her subsequent marriage to her captor legalized after the fact by the simple act of consummation, which was considered rape by any modern standard, a practice that cemented the idea that a woman's consent was irrelevant to her fate, and that her body was a prize to be taken by force and later legitimized by societal approval. These traditions, while perhaps less immediately lethal than dowry murders or consummation checks, were no less effective in reinforcing the same brutal hierarchy. They served as constant, terrifying reminders that the community was always watching, that any deviation from the prescribed path would be met with vicious ridicule and violence, and that the union of marriage was never about the happiness of the individuals involved, but about enforcing conformity, settling economic scores, and maintaining a social order where any expression of individual desire was a threat to be crushed, either through the barrel of a gun or the deafening judgment of the crowd. At the most extreme end of this spectrum of marital horror lay traditions that transcended mere earthly transactions and entered the realm of the cosmic, where the ultimate price for a successful union was not wealth or honor, but human life itself, a practice evidenced in the chilling archaeological discoveries of retainer sacrifice, a widespread funerary custom where servants, guards, and attendants were ritually killed, often in a horrific state of induced compliance through sedatives, and entombed alongside deceased royalty to serve them in the afterlife, a fate that, for some, was intrinsically linked to the marital bond and the need to maintain the same hierarchy beyond the grave. The most famous evidence comes from the royal cemetery of Ur, where the elaborate tomb of Queen Puabi contained the meticulously arranged bodies of over 24 retainers, including soldiers, handmaidens, and charioteers, all adorned in their finest regalia and bearing traces of poison, suggesting they drank a lethal potion in a solemn ceremony to accompany their mistress into eternity, ensuring she would lack for nothing, including the status conferred by a full retinue in the world to come. This concept extended to the marital unit itself, as evidenced in numerous ancient cultures, where the death of a king was not infrequently followed by the ritual sacrifice of his primary wife or wives, a practice documented among the Scythians, various Mesopotamian dynasties, and in early Chinese aristocracy, where the widow was expected, or more accurately, forced to undergo sati centuries before the Indian practice of the same name, her life extinguished to preserve the sanctity and companionship of the royal marriage for eternity, transforming the wedding vow of "till death do us part" into a death sentence. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Mayans took this a step further, intertwining marriage, divinity, and sacrifice in their public ceremonies. During the coronation of a new emperor, or the wedding of a high noble to a representative of a fertility goddess, the culmination of the event could involve the ritual sacrifice of a captured warrior or a specially chosen slave, their heart torn out in an offering to the gods, to bless the union and ensure the fertility of the couple and by extension the entire kingdom, directly linking the act of marital creation with the act of violent destruction. These were not hidden atrocities, but central, sanctified state religious events designed to awe the populace and demonstrate the ultimate power of the ruler, a power so absolute it commanded life and death, even in the context of matrimony. The message was clear. A royal marriage was of such cosmic importance that it required the ultimate validation of blood, and the lives of those deemed lesser were a small price to pay to ensure the divine couple wanted for nothing in this life or the next, cementing the idea that from its highest to its lowest expressions, marriage was a system built on the consumption of others, whether through their labor, their autonomy, or their very last breath. The gradual erosion of these brutal traditions was not born from a sudden, collective moral awakening, but from a violent clash of cultures and the calculated self-interest of foreign powers, beginning in earnest during the colonial era, when British officials, horrified by practices like sati and child marriage, moved to outlaw them not solely out of humanitarian concern, but to legitimize their own rule by positioning themselves as enlightened saviors against a backdrop of what they now framed as barbaric customs. Yet this external suppression created a complex and paradoxical legacy, where genuine progress was achieved through the heavy hand of imperialist dogma, which in turn sparked nationalist backlash and drove many practices underground rather than eradicating their underlying cultural logic. However, the most insidious and effective cover-up was not performed by ancient conspiracies, but by Victorian and Edwardian-era historians, archaeologists, and museum curators in the West who, upon uncovering the undeniable evidence of these practices in legal texts, art, and artifacts, were so scandalized by what they found that they engaged in a systematic campaign of academic censorship and historical whitewashing to protect their own preconceived notions of a noble, progressive past, and to maintain the facade of their own moral superiority. When translators encountered explicit accounts of dowry murders or child marriage in ancient papyri or medieval chronicles, they deliberately employed euphemistic language, translating terms for institutionalized rape as conjugal duties, and describing the murder of a bride for her dowry as a tragic domestic accident, thereby sanitizing the historical record for public consumption and future generations of scholars. Museum directors, including powerful figures like Augustus Pitt Rivers in England, established strict protocols where artifacts depicting sexual violence or the tools of marital coercion such as chastity belts or the bedsheets from consummation checks were deemed unfit for public exhibition and locked away in private storage rooms or restricted scholarly collections, their very existence denied to the general populace. While public galleries presented a curated, romantic vision of the past, full of beautiful wedding chalices and loving couple portraits, this academic suppression was enforced at the highest levels. University departments refused to fund research into the darker aspects of marital history. Academic journals rejected papers on the topic, and any scholar who dared to focus on this unsavory subject matter faced professional ostracism, effectively cutting off the oxygen of intellectual inquiry and ensuring that the official historical narrative remained one of chivalry and sacred unions, a glorious lie built on the hidden foundation of unimaginable suffering. The result of this century-long cover-up is a pervasive and damaging historical illiteracy that continues to shape modern debates about marriage and gender roles. By denying the brutal reality of these traditions, we have created a false nostalgia for a past that never existed, undermining our understanding of how recently and how fragilely many of our modern freedoms were won, and allowing the toxic ideologies that fueled these practices to persist in new, subtler forms, hidden not in locked museum vaults, but in plain sight, within the echoes of our own lingering prejudices. The most terrifying aspect of these historical horrors is not that they are forgotten relics of a barbaric past, but that their ideological DNA is woven into the very fabric of our modern wedding traditions, creating a chilling continuity where the echoes of ownership, transaction, and sanctioned coercion still resonate in the rituals we perform today, often without a second thought, revealing that the dark heart of matrimonial history still beats beneath the veil of white lace and the shine of a diamond ring. The practice of a father giving away the bride is a direct and unambiguous relic of the transfer of property from one man to another, a ceremonial reenactment of the conventio in manuum where the woman, once the legal property of her father, is presented as a gift to become the legal property of her husband, a moment framed as tender but rooted in a history where she had no say in the matter. The white wedding dress, universally celebrated as a symbol of purity and innocence, is in fact a relatively modern invention popularized by Queen Victoria that serves as a public advertisement of the bride's virginity, a soft power evolution of the bloody sheet display, subjecting her to the same old judgment under a more aesthetically pleasing guise. The asking, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" during the ceremony is not a question, but a demanded ritual utterance that completes the transfer of authority. While the tradition of being carried over the threshold originates from the Roman superstition that a bride would bring bad luck if she tripped entering her new home for the first time, marking the transition into her husband's domain, where her every step was now scrutinized for its impact on his fortune. Even the seemingly innocuous wedding ring itself is a symbol with a dark past, originating in ancient Egypt and Rome as a literal brand of ownership, a physical marker that this woman was claimed and occupied, its circular shape representing eternity, but also an unbreakable chain. The engagement ring, particularly the diamond, finds its modern popularity in a 20th century marketing campaign by De Beers that brilliantly exploited this ancient anxiety about female fidelity and male ownership, creating a market where the price of a gem became the measure of a man's commitment and a woman's secured status. This is just the beginning. The dark history of marriage reveals a truth about human society itself that is even more disturbing. Subscribe if you have the stomach to go deeper down this rabbit hole. These are not harmless traditions. They are the ghostly remains of a system that viewed women as chattel, and their persistence normalizes the underlying ideologies of possession and control, allowing them to mutate into modern forms like online forums, where men debate the monetary value of a virgin bride, or the terrifying resurgence of purity balls, where young girls pledge their virginity to their fathers until it is transferred to a husband. To participate in these rituals unaware is to be a passive actor in the erasure of their brutal history, but to recognize them for what they are is to begin the vital work of exorcising the past, of consciously choosing which traditions to discard and which to redefine, transforming marriage from an institution built on ownership into one truly founded on equal partnership, by understanding that the past is never truly past until we stop mindlessly repeating its scripts. The walk down the aisle was never a promise of safety, but a path into a system of sanctioned horror. For thousands of years, the wedding ceremony was not a celebration of love, but a ritual of transfer, a public dramatization of ownership that often ended in unimaginable trauma. We dressed it in flowers and called it tradition, but the historical record, once uncensored, tells a far more terrifying story. The echoes of these practices still linger in modern customs, a ghostly reminder of a time when the most intimate human connections were weaponized for control. If this journey into the heart of matrimonial darkness has you questioning everything you thought you knew about history's most cherished institution, you need to see what we've uncovered next. The video on your screen right now reveals the truth about history's most sadistic rulers. Click it now to continue uncovering the past's darkest secrets. And if you're brave enough to keep exploring with us, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're just getting started, peeling back the layers of history they never wanted you to see.